where he lived for 20 years, and he was the first, perhaps the only president who was fluent in Mandarin Chinese. He was also fluent in Spanish. So he was an international kind of guy. Besides working in China, he worked in Burma, and then he went to Australia, where he made his big fortune in the mining industry. He developed a process for removing sulfides from silver and zinc ore, which vastly increased the productivity of the mining industry. And he returned home to California in 1914, an extremely wealthy man. One can think of him in terms of today's Silicon Valley tycoons or venture capitalists. He was quoted as saying, when he returned home, let's see, he would have been 40 years old at the time, "If a man has not made $1 million by the time he is 40, he is not worth much." Now, $1 million, of course, back then would be at least $100 million today. So, having come home at the age of 40, he retired from business, and he entered into public life. With the outbreak of World War I in 1914, President Wilson sent him to Europe, and he arranged the evacuation of 120,000 U.S. citizens who wanted to return home rather than stay in the belligerent countries during the war. He then led a food relief effort in Europe, organizing a private international agency that developed ways of preventing the Allied armies from appropriating food. He became a symbol of civil society at work, of organizing private forces to achieve goals which had nothing to do with the goals of the nations, the national governments involved. This effort, those two efforts, made him a national hero. The evacuation of over 100,000 U.S. citizens and the feeding of millions of people who otherwise might have starved to death. And doing it in a way that he stood above, outside the conflict between Germany, Britain, and France, and was doing it on the terms of defining a specific need and coming up with a scientific way of addressing that need. When the United States entered the war in April 1917, President Wilson appointed Hoover the director of the U.S. Food Administration. So Hoover was personally in charge of what food was grown, where it was shipped to, what prices were charged for various types of food, and how many calories a day people should have, and what kind of food they should eat. Hoover and his staff established set days to encourage people to avoid eating particular food so there would be enough food to send to the soldiers. Meatless Mondays, wheatless Wednesdays, and then they had a phrase, "When in doubt, eat potatoes." This program helped reduce the domestic consumption of foodstuffs so they could be sent overseas, and at the same time it avoided rationing at home. So the United States of the belligerents was the only one that did not have a formal food rationing program at the time. Now, government publicists who understood that Hoover was already a national hero began to appropriate the figure Hoover's public image and associate it with the fact that Americans were being able to eat well while they they adjusted their diets. And so the whole program was called Hooverizing the American food. And this was in spite of Hoover's continual orders that publicity should not mention him by name, but the government publicists went ahead and did so anyway. When the war ended, Hoover returned to Europe, and he was in charge of all food relief programs in post-war Europe. He led the effort to end the famine in Russia caused by the Civil War, He is generally credited with having saved 5 million people from death by starvation. And he returned home a hero. He was also a hero in the Soviet Union. And both parties in 1920 tried to recruit him to run for president. His only previous engagement with electoral politics had been to support the 1912 campaign of Theodore Roosevelt for president, which made sense as a progressive businessman with an international outlook. He liked Roosevelt's application of scientific management to principles of government. Woodrow Wilson felt that the only person who could succeed him as president and continue the job that he had done for both internal reform and the construction of a new international order was Herbert Hoover. But Hoover declined all these efforts, and instead he endorsed Warren G. Harding, who was the governor of Ohio running for the nomination of the Republican Party. Harding, in exchange, appointed Hoover Secretary of Commerce. The Department of Commerce was relatively new, and it was considered a very minor cabinet post. But Hoover transformed it into one of the most important positions in U.S. government, in the federal government, during the 8 years that he held that position. He envisioned the Commerce Department, and this was really very consistent with Theodore Roosevelt's new nationalism, as the hub of the nation's growth and stability. From Harding, he asked Harding, and received authority to coordinate all economic affairs that government activities involved. So that included War and Naval Department procurements, the Treasury, aspects of the Treasury that dealt with with economic planning and fiscal planning. And Hoover created many, many sub-departments and committees which oversaw and regulated everything from manufacturing statistics, that is, to develop a sense of exactly how much every industry is producing, what kind of products, and what are they selling them for. He revamped the census, and he was central to developing radio as a viable commercial medium. He also developed the standards that allow, now when I say he, what I meant was that he appointed committees of experts, and then he went out and convince people to implement the recommendations of the experts. So his committee within the Commerce Department developed the standards for that airports still use, but they've been modernized, of course, that would allow an air transportation system to develop in an efficient way. So you could begin to know when you could catch a plane to go where. In some instances, Hoover was quite aggressive. He thought that other cabinet secretaries were sleeping on the job when there was an important economic issue going on, and he seized control of that, some aspect of that department. He kept telling everybody that his job and the responsibility was to keep the economy going and to create jobs for people. He was very aggressive in those senses, and he thought the greater, not government control of the economy, but government coordination, the setting up of frameworks that would create predictability in new areas, would allow businesses to expand into those areas, and they couldn't do it themselves, so they had a hard time figuring out how to come to an agreement, and he, as Secretary of Commerce, could cut through the competition, because he's supposedly neutral, and during the war he had developed a reputation as a person who could be absolutely neutral. So Hoover became one of the most visible men in the country and he generally overshadowed both presidents he served, President Harding and Coolidge, neither of whom really, who were older style politicians. They were not, they had developed their political careers in an era when you didn't have to be a public figure. One of his major achievements was promoting product standardization. So if you bought, for instance, screws, they would come in certain kinds of sizes, no matter what company you bought them for, and they could be used, the screws could be used in a variety of different situations, no matter which product you were working with. He opened offices overseas to promote international trade, and he developed a campaign to promote more widespread ownership of single-family dwellings. And he worked with bankers in the savings and loan industry to promote longer-term home mortgages. The standard home mortgage in the United States up to this time had been 5 to 10 to 15 years. So mortgages tended to be very short. So they had to be paid off pretty quickly. He pioneered the 20 and 30 year, or his office pioneered the 20 and 30 year mortgage. He took the leading role in writing the Radio Act of 1927, which allowed the government, which established the principle that the government owned the airwaves and it licensed use of the airwaves to private companies, and those companies had, as part of the license, had to dedicate certain numbers of hours to public service, and he was his office was very stringent in making sure that the public service time was actually complied with. He hosted 2 national conferences on street traffic, one in 1924 and the third in 1926, which were collectively called the National Conferences on Street and Highway Safety. They were addressing the growing casualty toll of traffic accidents, but the scope grew and embraced motor vehicle standards, how heavy should a car be, how fast could it go, what kind of rules of the road should be present, and principles of urban traffic control. At the end of these 2 conferences, the system of traffic management that we use today in the United States emerged and was then adopted. Because he was interested in making sure that road and street safety satisfied the needs of the automotive trade associations, he allowed car dealers and the automobile companies to take the lead in writing most of these rules, which he thought was if the rules were not good for the businesses that were involved, then they would not be, they would never really work. Or if they worked, they would limit the economy in some way rather than expand the economy. In 1927, the Mississippi River flooded,